Thank you for joining me for another episode of Awaken and Power TV. I'm your host, Ethann Fox. Today I'm joined by Brien Foerster, who is an expert in ancient civilization, and also he's studied a lot of elongated skulls around the world and has done DNA testing and has a lot of very interesting theories about the origins of many other subspecies of the human race. So we talk about all of those subjects today. We discuss ancient sites around the world and why they were built and some of the benefits to raising consciousness. We also discuss the Great Flood and other cataclysms that have existed in our prehistory. So a lot of very fascinating subjects in this 2-hour conversation today. I also want to tell you we have our Awaken Empowered Expo, our fourth one, coming up this November 4th, 5th, and 6th, 2016. And at that expo, we have a lot of amazing presenters, including Dr. Robert Schoch, who we discuss in my conversation with Brien today. Dr. Robert Schoch will be speaking about ancient civilizations and his theories on how old a lot of these structures are and how a lot of old these civilizations were based on his research. We also have Dr. Eric Pearl, who was on my show last week, speaking about reconnective healing and energy healing. Michaela Sheldon, who is on my show a lot, who will be doing a 2-hour event, doing a live channeling, and also a private workshop for a limited number of people. Kevin Ryan, Anya Lightheart, who is a local, who's just up and coming, doing Akashic record clearing, and she'll be on some panels there. George Lamoureux and Chinese herbalism, Ken Chorley doing a telekinesis demonstration, Barb Morey will be doing a workshop on aura reading. A lot of other amazing presenters, including Dixon's Violin doing a performance for us Friday night to kick off the event. And he's a very high consciousness musician. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. People have some amazing experiences with him the last time we had him out. So an event you don't want to miss, go to www.aaeexpo.com, and I hope I'll see you there. So for today, without any further delay, I'd like to bring on Brien Foerster. Hello, Brien. Welcome to Awaken to Power TV. It's nice to finally meet you, and I'm really thrilled to speak about the subjects that are your areas of expertise over the next couple of hours. And I, from what I understand, you're calling from an area where you do a considerable amount of research.
That's right. I'm in a seaside town called Paracas, which is 4 hours south of Lima. And this is where the famous Paracas culture with the elongated heads existed up until 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that in a minute. Could we start with maybe a little bit of background about your history, your education, anything that may inform our viewers as to the foundation on which you started this journey and that led to the work that you're doing now?
Well, sure. I have an honors degree, Bachelor's of Science from the University of Victoria. So I studied biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics, etc. That's my formal background. I don't have any real education in archaeology because I'm outside of I try to stay outside of the standard approach to ancient cultures and subjects and try to get more of a rounded view from different disciplines rather than specifically from archaeology itself.
And was there any early childhood influences or anything? Did you know that you were going to head in this direction? What did you do prior to this?
Oh, a lot of things. I've been fascinated by Native American culture since I was a child growing up. I was actually a professional totem pole carver for a number of years. I also lived in Hawaii working on cultural projects. And I've always been fascinated by ancient enigmas, ancient cultures, lost human history, etc.
And what have you found from, well, let's talk about where you are now and some of the findings there, and then we can come back around other things. So you've done a lot of research into elongated skulls, and I believe you've done some DNA testing as well as carbon-14 dating. What are you finding in the skulls that you're finding in that immediate area, or anything really globally in terms of your research?
Well, I first started to see the elongated skulls locally because I was or actually still am, the assistant director of the Paracas History Museum. operated by Senior Juan Navarro. And he had some of these skulls on display in his museum, and I just found them intriguing because they're larger than normal. And so that started my whole study. I, of course, looked for archaeological references and other scholarly works in relation to this, and there was very little, which astonished me. So I took on the job myself, and that led to exploring not just locally the phenomenon, but it was a global phenomenon of cranial deformation on 6 of the 7 continents. But the ones in Peru and Bolivia are by far the most intriguing and largest in the world.
And now I know a lot of cultures in more recent times have intentionally elongated the skulls of their children in order to, what appears to mimic their ancient gods or leaders from ancient times. How can you tell the difference? Because I'm sure you're finding both. How can you tell the difference between, and have you found a difference between the skulls that were artificially elongated of regular human beings versus skulls that look to have been born that way and maybe even have genetic characteristics that are different than humans?
Well, that's taken a lot of work. The vast majority of elongated, or I shouldn't say elongated, but cranial deformed skulls, or so-called elongated skulls, are the result of artificial cranial deformation. And that's most of the examples on the planet. So what is commonly called cranial headboarding was the technique used whereby a baby's head would be wrapped with a fabric and then usually a board in the front and the back, and that would cause a flattening of the forehead and the back of the skull. So after seeing hundreds, if not thousands of them, I started to notice that some of the Paracas ones could not have been, the shape could not have been achieved using that technique because they're far too complicated. But in general, most of the cultures that had elongated skulls were the result of cranial deformation.
And the ones that you're finding that you don't believe you've done DNA testing on those? Have you found any results that would reinforce the belief that they were not human, basically Homo sapiens sapiens?
Well, it's taken a lot of work, and what I do is I always try to get professionals in the medical field, for example, because if you start to talk about something like a head is, if you're even to approach the idea that the head is not Homo sapiens sapiens, you can't base that on your own opinion. You actually need, it's not an archaeological question either, it's a medical question because you're looking at the form and shape of part of the human body. So fortunately, quite recently, I had a radiologist from the United States visiting me. We went to Bolivia and also Peru. And I showed him examples of extremely elongated skulls. And a radiologist is the ultimate professional in the world to look at something like this. And with some of the examples, he simply claimed, those are not human. And I said, well, what do you mean? Do you mean they're not Homo sapiens sapiens? And he said, yes, the whole structure of the skull, where the suture lines are, where the plates meet, there's no way that that's the result of cranial deformation. So you're looking at, if nothing else, a subspecies of humanity.
And how are the sutures different in these beings compared to regular human beings?
Well, all living and deceased human beings have 4 major cranial plates. You have the frontal plate here, 2 parietal plates here, and the occipital plate in the back. So in the intriguing elongated skull, the suture line here between the parietals is simply not there. And I've asked many medical professionals about that in person, and none of them have an answer to it. Also, what this radiologist Ken found out was he said that where this suture line comes across and where the fontanelle, which is where the bones fuse together, or the plates fuse together in a baby at about 2 years old, he said that in the elongated skulls, that suture line is 7 centimeters higher than it should be. And he said that can't be the result of cranial deformation. That's a genetic characteristic. Because if you change the shape of the skull, you're simply going to be flattening the front of the head. But he said since the suture is 7 centimeters higher, that's a completely different genetic phenomenon.
And from what I understand, there are also 2 holes in the back of these skulls. Is that the case in all of them?
True. That's true. In all of the elongated ones, that's the case. And again, the question is, what are they for? And what we have, and again, you ask the radiologist, we have foramen here, which are 2 little holes, and in different places on our skull. And that's where nerve and blood flow come out, because especially here is so far from the spinal cord and circulatory system that that's a genetic characteristic. And so for these 2 holes to be in the back of the head here, he said that that would be because the skull is elongated, and so that implicates evolution.
And do you have any evidence that supports that the brain cavity was actually filled with the brain of these beings, or compared to, say, people who had their skulls elongated artificially?
Well, if you artificially alter the skull, you're not going to increase the cranial capacity, because the body is programmed so that these plates move together and join. So it's almost like having a clay pot that isn't dry yet. You can alter its shape, but you won't alter the volume. And so we can easily look inside the elongated skulls, because where the vertebrae enter, the spinal cord, you can simply take a flashlight and look inside. And where you see vein impressions, then that's where you see where the brain was actually in contact with the bone. And there's no case that I've seen where you have missing vein marks. So that tells you that the skull was filled with brain. And in some cases, the brains were 25 to 30% larger than a normal human being.
Do you have any hypothesis or even any theories on what kind of mental capacity these individuals might have had that's different from what we have today because of that brain size?
Yeah, again, if you look at the normal parameters, which is between 1,200 and 1,400 cubic centimeters, we're talking 25% greater than that. And the way we measure it is simply by pouring sand inside the skull. And so you take a normal skull and cranially deformed skulls, and you fill the cavity with sand, pour it back out, measure the volume, and that's the process that we used.
Now, are there any writings or any kind of ancient writings that you have discovered that explain why these more modern cultures started deforming their skulls artificially? Is there a direct connection to, or are there any stories that you've heard, I'm sure, through some of maybe the tribes that are still present on Earth today, as to the origins of that tradition?
Yeah, well, up until recently, there were people called the Mangbetu who still live in the Congo area of Africa. Up until the 20th century, they were still deforming their babies. And as well in Melanesia, the same situation up until the 20th century. I think missionaries and governments decided to forbid the process. But if you look globally, there are 3 characteristics or 3 reasons in general why the nobility, and it was only the noble class of a people would do this. One is that they thought that it made the children more intelligent. Number 2, they found it aesthetically pleasing. And number 3, that's where the ancient, or that's what the ancient ancestors looked like.
And there are a lot of sculptures, even Egyptian sculptures or sculptures of the Anunnaki, a variety of other different races that depict them with elongated skulls. Is that not the case?
It is. I mean, the most famous depictions of elongated skulls would be from the Akhenaten Amarna period of Egypt, which is the 18th dynasty. And he he was very much a rebellious pharaoh. And one of the things that he did, aside from moving the capital city from Thebes to a new location, was he allowed his artists to depict anything that they wanted. And so for some reason, he allowed the artists to make sculptures of his daughters, of which he had 6, with extremely elongated heads. And I recently wrote a book about Akhenaten, exploring that and other aspects of his life.
Do you have any belief or any research you've done into what these beings were? Or were they extraterrestrial? Or were they just an offshoot of Homo sapiens that just happened to have not evolved into the modern time, or maybe they still exist but not in the public anyway?
Well, it depends where in the world you look. In the case of Akhenaten, they've never found his skull. They've never found Nefertiti's skulls. They've never found the skulls of his daughters. So you can't automatically say that they looked like that, because you're talking about art. You're not talking about actual fact. But the question is, why would he allow this depiction? And that is what part of my book was about. He was very much adept at the mystery schools of Egypt. So he knew a lot of the secret history that went back far farther back than the Pharaonic period, which started about 3000 BC. And I think what he was intimating was that his bloodline came from a very special type of person / being depicted with elongated heads. And the oldest representation we would have of that would be Osiris.
Now, I know you've done some research, and I think you even worked with Lloyd Pye before with the Star Child skull. Is that correct?
I was an associate with Lloyd. Unfortunately, he and I were in contact for about a year, quite constantly, because he was fascinated by the Paracas elongated skulls, and we had arranged for him to come down and do a tour, but unfortunately he died of cancer 6 months before that. But he was a very intelligent man. He was ridiculed by academics because he didn't have any special university degrees, but he was a very profoundly brilliant researcher, and some of the work that he has done, I think, will endure for a long time.
And from what I remember, the DNA testing he did on the skull concluded that it was a hybrid between a human female and something else, or that some other being that they couldn't identify. Is that correct?
Basically, that's it. They found certain segments of the DNA which didn't match anything human, and then they traced it back. It didn't match anything primate. It didn't match anything mammalian. So unfortunately, not much has been done since his death, but I'm hoping that the Star Child Foundation will be able to continue with Lloyd's work, because I think it's very important.
Have you found any other instances of hybrid beings with unusually shaped skulls that might make you draw the conclusion that a lot of people tend to believe in, including the books by Zecharia Sitchin that seem to speculate that there was some sort of genetic experimentation done on the human beings that were on Earth at the time that these extraterrestrial beings came to Earth?
Well, it's indeed possible. The problem is you can't test for alien DNA, because what the program does, the massive computer program in these multi-billion-dollar machines, is it'll take your DNA sample, for example, and then it can match it up with what it has in reference. So it can match your DNA with all of the known human DNA on the planet. And so that's why some people will be suddenly shocked to find out that, you know, they're white-skinned and blue-eyed and they're 2% Japanese somehow, or you know, other odd things show up like that. But there is no alien DNA in this database that we know of. So all you can do is, if there is DNA that doesn't match what's in the database, it'll simply say unknown. And that's where we are at this point.
And when it says unknown, is that a pretty accurate indication that it's definitely not human then?
No, coming from a scientific background, I'm very pragmatic to start with before I get too speculative. But what it tells you is it doesn't match anything that we know of. So the first thing that you would think of would be, well, maybe a subspecies of human that hasn't been found. And as time goes on, more and more subspecies are being discovered, such as, of course, Neanderthal, Denisovan, which was discovered about, I think, 10 years ago, and the Hobbit people of Indonesia that were found, I think, about 5 years ago. So there are probably many more subspecies of humans or humanoids that lived on our planet that were either interbred with us to the point where their DNA became almost nothing, or you can start to speculate beyond that.
So is it possible that this is what is referred to as junk DNA, that DNA that we can't identify within our own genome that could be somehow related to other types of races that previously might have existed on Earth?
I think so, because it's a pretty pathetic thing to label something as junk, as if nature would produce something that wouldn't be used. So I think it's a cover story for them when they can't come up with a logical explanation for what the DNA functions as, that they will simply say, well, it's junk.
And the Hobbit people, how tall were they?
I think about 3'6".
Okay, so this is an entire race of beings that were that height then?
Yeah, and I think what happened to them, the same with Denisovan, is they were either absorbed into our DNA, or because we're the most destructive species on the planet, they could very well have been wiped out by us through competition, because we've shown ourselves to be very good at not only being able to exist anywhere on the planet, but also being able to destroy anything that gets in our way. So that's why I think that many other subspecies of humans will show up who were the victims of our somewhat nasty nature.
Now, there seems to be, from your work, from what I understand, a dominance of ancient races that had red-colored hair. Is that prevalent among a lot of ancient races, and why has that not really carried through to us in a very big way?
Well, it's a very complex story and very intriguing. Most people think that red hair is from Ireland or Scotland, but because I'm writing a book right now about the Paracas people, they genetically had red hair, which has been shown now. And so when you trace back where does red hair come from, it's actually from Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So what that's telling us, as well as the DNA evidence, is that the Paracas did not cross the Bering Land Bridge and travel all the way down the west coast of the Americas to reach Peru. They must have come probably by sea, and now I'm trying to track down where from, and that's where the beginnings of the DNA evidence is beginning to tell us the story. But it's only the beginning right now.
From your pragmatic, more scientific viewpoint, is there anything to suggest that at least some of these races could have come from somewhere else other than originating here on Earth?
Again, it is possible, but I don't speculate very much. If we can find the actual evidence of a non-human ancestry, then I would definitely welcome it. But I can't, I can't say yes, it is the case, or yes, it could be the case. I'm looking for a earthly explanation first, but if that can't be satisfied, then we have to look elsewhere.
I believe you've done some investigation into some of the Native American burial mounds. I don't remember if I think it was in the United States or somewhere, that were supposedly the burial sites of giants. Have you actually done that?
Not directly, but I do have people who I work with, such as L.A. Marzulli, who is actively studying this phenomenon, as well as Hugh Newman from England and Jim Vieira from the US and many others. And there is a lot of evidence that there was a race of people who were much taller than the Native American people. And the Native Americans have a number of different legends and stories stating that there was a different race of being or people who were quite a bit taller than them, that they savagely fought and eventually defeated. So among the Paiute people around Serpent Mound, in Ohio, et cetera, et cetera. So in my work and also through my growing up, I've consulted with Native Americans a lot. And so when they have so many different stories stating that these giant people, probably 7 or 8 feet, did exist, then I am very likely to believe them, because this is part of their tradition. It is their history. They didn't make the stories up. The problem we've had is that institutions such as the Smithsonian in Washington, especially in the 19th century, whenever a story would show up stating that someone had found a giant skeleton, again, we're talking 7 to 9 feet tall, we're not talking 20 feet tall, that they would get someone or send someone out to take that material back to the Smithsonian. So that's why we don't have any direct evidence. All of it is being covered up by the Smithsonian and other institutions.
And the Native Americans, are they, so what is Serpent Mound? Is that an actual burial site of these, theoretically?
According to stories that I've heard, the Native American people of the area say that they didn't build that. It was there when they arrived. And that's the story that you get in Peru as well, with different things, with megalithic structures and things like that. There's been literally a whitewashing of history as the result of what you would know of as manifest destiny, which was the expansion of the white and other civilizations moving into the United States, Canada, etc. In order to be able to appropriate land, they would concoct stories that all Native Americans lived in little clusters or villages, and therefore they didn't use all this land, and therefore we're going to take it over. And they have destroyed a lot of the history as a result of that. But luckily, a lot of Native Americans still have their oral tradition, and you can access that, if you're fortunate, directly from them.
I've heard some theories that there were giants that were 70 feet tall, and I'm sure you've seen the footprint embedded in, I think it's stone in South Africa. That's about the size of a normal human being. That looks like a human footprint. Do you have any theories on that? Do you believe that? Have you researched that? Do you believe that that's a real footprint?
I've actually been there. So that's what I always have to say is an important point. If you haven't been to a place, it's difficult to have an opinion because you're looking at a photograph. And we were there with, actually with geologist Robert Schock. And he looked, this man's a geologist. He looked at what the stone is. It's a granite-like stone, but it's very soft. And we were able to take stones and hit surrounding stones of the area, and the stuff would fall apart really easily. So we surmised that was simply made by a native person of the area, probably as a trail marker, because anatomically it does have 5 toes, but it doesn't show the actual depression of a human foot. So if anyone says that that's a true artifact, I'm sorry, it's not, because I was there.
So what are the tallest that you've heard that these giants were?
I think realistically 7 feet, 8 feet, maybe 9 feet. And that's within the realm of possibility of biology. Of course, there are modern basketball players that are 7 feet plus. There are realistic stories of people who could have been 8, maybe 9 feet. But if you go beyond that, I don't have any evidence whatsoever of anyone being 20 feet tall. And that's also the problem with a lot of ancient stories, is that they tend to be like fishing stories where somebody says it was, I caught a fish that was 6 feet long, when in fact it was 2 feet long. It sounds better if you make it bigger, but I've seen no concrete evidence of the existence of overly massive humanoid people.
And do you believe that Neanderthals are still around somewhere on Earth? I know at least in, I believe something Lloyd Pye was talking about in Russia not that long ago, there was supposedly a female Neanderthal that lived there. Do you have any evidence to support that?
Yeah, it's possible, or what is called Bigfoot or Sasquatch or the Yeti. There are a lot of native traditions that these very tall people, quote unquote, have existed for hundreds or if not thousands of years in, for example, Washington, Oregon, British Columbia areas, and that they still exist to this day. And I know people who are very serious Bigfoot investigators who have had almost direct experience with them. So I definitely believe that they do still exist. Neanderthal, unlikely, but possible in some very remote areas of Russia.
I've seen a video of you investigating a very small creature about 5, 6, or 7 inches tall, and that had wings. Have you actually done testing on that to validate whether that was a real living? Because it looks like it was a fairy or something, right?
It's very weird, and I've been attacked for even photographing or showing photographs of myself with it. But I have physically seen it. If someone had shown me a picture of it, I'd just say, well, that's a Hollywood prop, or some very clever person was able to make it. But I come from a biological background, and I was at Jaime Maussan's office in Mexico City, and he simply took this thing out of his cupboard and put it on his front desk in front of me, and he said, "What do you think of that?" And I examined it for half an hour, and I don't see how possibly somebody could have faked it. It looks like some kind of cross between a bat and a human, and I don't know what else, but it had fur. It had 5 fingers on each hand, 5 toes on each foot, and 2 wings. And then X-rays were sent to a veterinarian in the United States, and he believes that it once was a living being. It's thought to have died about 5 years ago from a shotgun wound. And there's a veterinarian saying, I can see where the attachments of the limbs, different limbs are. I see where the wings would attach. So he thought it was real, and he's an expert.
Now, didn't it have some sort of a metallic brace or something in its legs?
Yeah, that I'm going to have to do more research on. We're hoping to go back to Mexico in about 1.5 years, and hopefully I'll get to go see Jaime again. Now that this thing is out in the public, he tried to restrict publication of it because it was his material. But now that it's more or less a worldwide thing, I think he'll allow me to go back and have a look at it again and take some really good video to present to physicians and anatomists and radiologists.
And what did the DNA test find?
Well, a secondary test was done, and I don't have the results of that yet, but the problem with the first test that was done was that this creature thing was placed in formaldehyde to preserve it, and formaldehyde destroys DNA. So I believe the first test was basically unsuccessful or inconclusive.
I see. So are there any other very fascinating discoveries you found in terms of unusual beings in different parts of the world? I know you travel all around and you collect quite a few things. Are there any other ones that we've not brought up yet today?
Not really. Again, when I see something firsthand, then it gains my interest. But I'm not really interested in cryptozoology that much. And because of Photoshop, there's so much fakery going on about everything now that unless you are able to see something one-on-one and then be able to take good photographs and video to present to actual experts in the medical field, then it's not something I really pursue.
So I know you've done a lot of research into ancient architecture and archaeology and visited quite a few sites around the world. What's your, one of the questions that I'm curious about is there are quite a few box-shaped objects, it seems like, in different sites around the world, including in the Great Sphinx. There's a sarcophagus figure, and I'm trying to remember the other location where there are very large, I think, granite box-shaped architectural formations left behind. Do you have any theories on what those were used for?
Well, the place you're referring to is called the Serapeum.
Yes.
And it's at the site called Saqqara, which is one of the largest archaeological sites in Egypt. And these are in a system of 2 tunnels. They were discovered in the 19th century, opened, as in the lids were slightly ajar. Nothing was found in any of them. There were, I think, 27 of them, and each one weighs 100 tons. The lid is 30 tons, and the box itself is 70 tons. And the lid and the box were originally one piece of stone. So the original block of stone would have weighed more than 200 tons. No one knows exactly where the stone comes from, and no one knows how they were able to get the stone into these tunnels, because you can barely, I think there's 1 foot space on either side in the niches where they're placed. So they're a complete mystery. The Egyptologists say that they were made for sacrificed Apis bulls, but because the material is granite or granodiorite, which is very hard, during the dynastic Egyptian times, they only had bronze chisels, and you can't shape granite with bronze. It's like trying to cut down a tree with a plastic knife. So these massive boxes that are incredibly well done and could basically not be created today had to have been made before the time of the dynastic Egyptians, and that gets into a whole new topic.
So if they can't be built even with our technology today, what are your how do you believe they were built, or do you have any theories on that?
Well, with them, and also with a lot of the megalithic work in both Egypt and also Peru and Bolivia, and even Baalbek in Lebanon, some places in Greece and Italy and other locations, we're looking at some kind of vibrational technology that we don't have today. I've been able to travel a lot with different engineers, and a few of them are able to step out of the box and stay and try to theorize what kind of technology would be involved. And they say that none of the technology that we have today could possibly have created these works. It had to have been done with some kind of vibrational technology, which presently is in the experimental stages in some of our best laboratories. And
now the conventional archaeologists don't really acknowledge pre-dynastic Egypt, right? Is there a reason for that?
Well, yeah, it's like a boys and girls club, and that's the problem with academia in general on some levels, is that they agree to certain things and they won't entertain anything else, and they won't consult with other experts such as geologists, engineers, stonemasons, etc., to ask their opinion on how things could have been made. They make up their own theories, and some of them honestly are quite laughable.
How far back in time does pre-dynastic Egypt go?
Well, dynastic Egypt in general begins about 3100 BC. So you're talking about 5,000 years. They say in general that the Great Pyramids were built about 2500 BC, so 4,500 years ago. But if you ask an engineer, especially one that's been on location in Egypt, they can't understand how we today could construct one of them with sky cranes and cranes in general, diamond cutting saws, etc. They are so massive in scale and so precise in the way that they were built that it would be hard-pressed for us to make them. So a Bronze Age culture, like the dynastic Egyptians, couldn't have made them. But the funny thing is that there are certain artifacts in the Cairo Museum, such as bowls and plates that had to have been turned on lathes, like you would turn a bowl. But these are bowls and plates made out of granite, crystal, basalt, diorite, all which would require at least diamond tools to achieve. And diamond tip tools were not invented until the 19th century. So they call those things pre-dynastic. And they are at least 21st century in terms of technological prowess.
So getting back to my earlier question, how far back in time does the pre-dynastic Egypt go in terms of our timeline, I mean?
Well, we're looking at the idea, and again, I recently wrote a book about a global cataclysm that happened 12,000 years ago, for which there's a lot of scientific evidence. So what we're calling the megalithic works, such as the Great Pyramid, the boxes in the Serapeum, and some of the works here in Peru and Bolivia to be pre-cataclysmic. So we're talking 12,000 plus years old.
Mm-hmm. I've spoken previously with Dr. Sam Osmanagic, and he was theorizing that some of the sites that he's found around the world, and even in Bosnia, I believe he said could be as old as 20,000 years or even older than that. Have you found that to be the case?
I think some of them could be that old. In terms of the Bosnian pyramids, I've never been there. Sam has actually invited me, but I haven't been. And again, if I haven't been to a location, I have no opinion because I can't base anything on photographs or even video. To be on location, especially with experts of different disciplines, makes a completely different, or tells a completely different story.
Some of the, I believe it's in Peru, I could be mistaken about the location, but some of the stone structures there are built in a very non-linear way, right? Where the stones are fit together in more trapezoidal patterns that are not exactly straight, 90-degree angles. Do you have any thoughts on how that could have been done?
Yeah, it's all what we call polygonal work. It's very organic looking. You see similar things in ancient Greece prior to the times of the Greeks. You don't see it so much in Egypt. Egypt is more linear. But nobody's been able to figure out how that stone was shaped. I was just there with a master stonemason from the United States, and he was completely dumbfounded because, as you said, there are no 90-degree angles. It's all organic. Each stone is of a different shape and size. None of the joints come together straight. They're always curved or compound curved. And the only theory we can come up with is a form of technology whereby the stone was for a short period of time made plastic. We have no idea how you could do that. Again, that would be probably a form of vibrational technology that altered the internal makeup of the molecular nature of the stone to make it pliant, so that you could literally build a wall using marshmallows, like marshmallow-like material. So it was hard material, it was softened to marshmallow stasis, and then hardened again. And we have no idea how you do that.
Was there any evidence to show that it was heated to do that, or that it was just somehow vibrationally altered on a molecular level?
Well, of course you would think you'd have to heat the stone in order to make it pliable, but we're thinking honestly of a technology whereby the stone wasn't necessarily heated. It was just altered to the point where it was plastic.
Now, I want to get a little philosophical for a second here and see what your thoughts are on this. But so in those cultures, considering that they followed a very nonlinear approach to architecture, and of course modern, more modern thinking engineers and would not necessarily understand the logic and even going that route, Do you think that maybe in more ancient times we had a more balanced left-right brain approach to our thinking, and possibly, or even maybe more skewed toward the right brain? And from that perspective, we tend to look at things differently, and maybe that even explains why a lot of these buildings were built, which today makes no real logical sense to us, some of the architecture we're finding.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think we've become far, at least in the Western mindset, we've become way too left-brained. Everything has to be logical. I try to use my right brain as much as my left. I was a sculptor for decades, which is a very left brain, right brain thing to do. And a lot of the evidence does point to the fact that our ancestors were far more balanced in the way that they looked at the world and reality, that creativity was used as much as logic, poetry was used as much as mathematics, etc. And we've fallen so far off that into the left brain that's why we demand evidence for everything. So for example, if somebody says UFOs don't exist, then that's someone who's never seen one. Because if you see one, you can't say they don't exist. But people will automatically jump on having an opinion without really using much of their brain power in order to think it through. In order to have an opinion that people will actually listen to.
Now, I've heard that, for example, some more ancient languages such as Sanskrit have multiple meanings, and that translating it directly into English, for example, we lose a lot of other dimensions of how it was used and what it meant, which may explain why just simply chanting Sanskrit words creates an altered state of consciousness. So maybe those languages were more multidimensional as opposed to just left brain intellectual as our languages are today. Now, have you found that a lot of the older languages, such as maybe hieroglyphics, which are more pictorial, might have contained multiple dimensions of understanding that maybe today, in our more rational left brain intellectual approach to translating, we are missing many other aspects of what it could have meant or how it could have impacted our human experience?
Oh, definitely. I mean, English is probably the world's worst language because it's made up of a bunch of different languages. They just throw a word in here, and if you get into ancient languages, then there are always layers of meaning, like the ancient or Hawaiian or the Polynesian languages, as well as the ancient Egyptian language, which is called Suf. Conversation is simply the superficial level of the language. There are layer upon layer upon layer of deeper meanings, depending upon how deep you want to go. So, for example, in the Hawaiian language, the name of a place isn't simply the name of the place, like we would call, something like location Tom's River, New Jersey. It's like, but in the Hawaiian, every place name is a description of the place. So Honolulu means the Bay of Oysters, or Waikiki means the place of spouting fresh water. It's a description of the place. And the Suf language of Egypt was exactly the same. It was a description. So you also get, as soon as you state the name of the place, you get a picture of the place or even a video in your mind, because it's almost telepathic that way. So I'm very fortunate in that I know two experts in Egypt who understand very profoundly what hieroglyphics are, and it's way beyond the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is not a good means of translating those symbols, especially into English, because what most people don't realize is that when the Greeks, who created the Rosetta Stone, and the Coptic Christians, it's because it's Greek, Coptic, Christian, and hieroglyphic, that the Greeks were not told the truth when they entered Egypt for the first time. They went in being quite arrogant and stating to to the priests of Egypt, we are a great nation who have come to envelop another great nation. And the comeback from the Egyptian priests was, you are children who don't even know your own history. So the Greeks were not given the proper translation of the hieroglyphics because it takes 20 years of education to learn what they mean. So all of the Egyptological translations, most of them are complete nonsense. And I'll give you one example. Nefertiti, of course, was the wife of Akhenaten. The proper translation of that is she who walks in harmony. Nefertiti. And that's a great description of a beautiful, graceful woman, which she was.
Now, do you believe that she was an actual being, a physical human being, or rather humanoid being, or some kind of a person who actually existed, or is it just a allegory to illustrate a point?
Oh, I think she definitely existed. That's why I wrote the book about Akhenaten. He also very much existed. The problem with their history was that the Amun priesthood, which were in power in Egypt, they controlled everything. They controlled the economy, they controlled thought, they controlled the royalty. That's why Akhenaten broke away from them, because he wanted to go back to the original meaning and belief system, which was called Aten, or the belief in the one. He didn't invent the idea of monotheism. He brought it back as a renaissance. So we know they did exist as people. The problem is that the Amun priesthood had them murdered, and likely their bodies were chopped into pieces and scattered so that their soul could never return. And they also tried to wipe out every trace of their existence. So that's why we only really know about them, or have known about them, for about the last 100 years, is that they did quite a good job of trying to erase historical figures.
Now, do you think that spoken language and written language always existed, or is that more of a more modern development in recorded history? Because a lot of more ancient languages seem to have been used for spiritual purposes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, most people would say that written language, or the ability to record written language was a triumph, because that way things could be recorded. But I think oral tradition is far more profound. And so if you have to memorize everything and keep that knowledge in your head, I honestly think that's a higher state of consciousness. I think writing is actually cheating. And also, if you write something down, it can be altered, which of course has happened all throughout history. The meanings of things can be changed. But in something like oral tradition, no matter where you are on the planet, there's a mandate with that the knowledge which is original has to be handed down exactly the way it was originally. And that's why oral tradition was such, and still is in some cultures, was such a profound thing. Storytellers in some traditions could speak about one story for 4 days. So that's how much of their mind had to be trained to record and remember information. Whereas we're actually getting quite lazy now. We have all these, we got all these toys now that we can put so many things into. So if anything happens to our technology, we're screwed. We are screwed, because we're getting into a point now where we're so heavily dependent on this stuff. It's getting kind of scary.
So is it possible that there is a correlation between us moving toward a more masculine focused world, which is a more left brain intellectual world, where academia is what is accepted as the mainstream foundation of our society, versus maybe in more ancient times it was either more balanced or more focused toward the feminine? And in that time there was not really so much written language. Is there a connection between the move toward intellectuality, left brain thinking, and the written language and violence and the kind of society we have today versus more ancient times? Or was that because you were sort of relating it to consciousness, having oral tradition being more of a higher consciousness approach to living?
Yeah, I think definitely. When we started moving into a patriarchal way, that was kind of the downfall of humanity, I think, and especially imposing it on other cultures, such as, of course, the Native Americans, Africans, basically everybody else, as the European civilization expanded to absorb the planet. Basically, we destroyed so much of the divine aspects of humanity, because from my research, in the past in general, I don't think it was necessarily the case that cultures were matriarchal as compared to patriarchal. I think there was a balance. There were aspects of knowledge and consciousness that the female was responsible for and very graceful and good at. And then there were aspects of consciousness, etc., that the male was very good at. And so when you have the two in harmony and working together, then you have a whole brain approach, whereas we now are very much in this left brain way of looking at things. And so we've lost the balance. And so I would like to see a greater enhancement and enrichment of the divine feminine in all of us, in order to achieve some kind of new balance for our human family in the future, because we're going down the wrong path right now, rapidly.
Backing up to what we were speaking about earlier about the Anunnaki, a lot of them are pictured as winged beings with elongated heads with beards. Have you found any evidence to support, or do you have any beliefs on why they were pictured that way?
I haven't delved too much in the Anunnaki, because it's become, when any subject becomes too popular, I don't want to look at it. So, because then you get so much spin and so much stuff made up and bad interpretations. So, for example, today I've just started writing a book about the Maya culture, because I need something to do, and also because I'm fascinated by them. But I've waited 4 years until after 2012, because that whole nonsense that went around about the end of the world, I just, it's like, forget it. I don't want to know anything about the Maya at this point. But now that that's settled down, people have forgotten about the Maya. It's time for me to study them. And so the same with the Anunnaki. Right now, it's become way too big. So at some point, I'll look at them. But Anunnaki, as far as I know, simply means the merging of heaven and earth, or the merging of those from heaven with those from the earth, which, of course, is also what Nephilim supposedly is. So you could be talking about aliens coming from another planetary system to mate with humanity. I'm far more looking at that as a possibility, rather than winged beings or angels or something like that. So I'll approach the Anunnaki likely when I actually make it to the Middle East at some point, which is not going to be for at least 2 or 3 years.
What about the flying men of Paracas? Well, what's the connection there?
Well, that is symbolic, and that's what people have to really understand. I've had the great fortune to be around Native American the Native American thought process since I was about 8 years old. So I'm able, on some level, to be able to see how they see things, because I'm a keen listener. And so the flying men of Paracas, which basically it's symbolic of these smiling guys literally flying, likely is based on the fact that their spiritual system incorporated the San Pedro cactus, which the juice or extract from the San Pedro is used for hallucinogenic experience. So what the Paracas were probably trying to show in their art was out-of-body experiences by using San Pedro.
Now, you've been all over the world and explored a lot of ancient sites, and I know you're connected very closely with many other archaeologists as well. Are there ancient sites all over the world, even in the United States? I think there's even a pyramid in Chicago, is there not?
Yeah, there's Cahokia, which is in that area. like most of them have been destroyed, which is very sad. There were probably thousands upon thousands of them. But again, with manifest destiny and the expansion of people from the East, the immigrants from the East, moving westward, farming, these things got in the way. And so they were destroyed to make more usable land. But unfortunately, the United States has lost a profound amount of its history, and Canada as well, because of the expansionist model. So whatever does remain, luckily, is being preserved, but we can't even calculate what there used to be.
I think Dr. Sam said that the pyramid in Chicago could very well be bigger than the Great Pyramid. Has any more excavation been done on that site?
Not that I know of, and unfortunately, I haven't been there. I've been interested for decades with Serpent Mound, etc., but I just it's not something that is really close on my radar at the moment. Hopefully, I have several decades to go before I go somewhere else, and I would love to study that stuff.
Now, are you seeing? I know, as we were speaking throughout this conversation, there seems to be a lot of suppression from the mainstream academic archaeological organization to keep a lot of this information hidden or to interpret it in a way that that's really doesn't take into consideration all the different factors such as geology and so on. Are you finding that that is still very prevalent, or is it starting to open up, and are we starting to see more information being released, or is that just happening through people like you who are out there, and Graham Hancock and Dr. Robert Schoch and so on, who are doing the alternative research?
Yeah, it's starting to fall apart, and rapidly too, because the mindset used to be that an archaeologist was the expert on ancient places, and that's it. So people would say, well, what do the archaeologists say about that? And then more and more through time now, we're getting into a more multifaceted approach to these things, because again, you have to bring the science into it, not just carbon-14 or radiocarbon dating that archaeologists will use, but you need to bring in physicists and engineers and stonemasons and chemists, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as many disciplines as possible. And where you get commonality, that's where you get reality in terms of history. So there will be in future, hopefully no more of this, I have a theory about how this was done. Also incorporating indigenous wisdom is vital to this, because very few archaeologists will consult with native people about their own history. So a classic example of that is Easter Island with the giant Moai figures. And for those who don't know, when you see the head sticking up out of the ground, there's a full body under the ground. And there are more than 900. So I know one of the great elders on Easter Island, or its proper name is Rapa Nui, and she said, no archaeologist has ever come and consulted with my family to ask us how these were made and how they were transported. They simply come up with competing theories. We have oral tradition that states how they were made and how they were moved, but they won't listen to us. That's racism.
And so what are they saying was the story behind how they were made and how they were moved?
Well, it depends. There are two different periods of them. So again, archaeologists will say they were all made by the same people, but Robert Schoch, the geologist, would say, no, I was with him on Easter Island, and he had no problem in believing that some of them are 12,000 years old based on weathering. So you have two periods. You have the Polynesian ones, which go back maybe 2,000 years, but when the Polynesians arrived on Easter Island, there were already people living there. And those people, to some level, had light skin and reddish hair, and they were the descendants of those who made the really large and complex Moai head figures.
So there are two different sizes. One's substantially larger, is it?
Yeah, in general, the really large ones are the oldest. They also have an aquiline nose, which is a European-looking nose. whereas the ones during the Polynesian period have more of a slightly flattened Polynesian nose. Yeah, the larger ones tend to be the oldest ones, and they are not Polynesian looking in terms of facial construction.
Now, I've heard some stories that that there were two different, I could be wrong about the time period, but not that long ago, in the last couple of 100 years, that there were, or maybe it's a few hundred years, where there were two different races of beings living there, one that were giants and one that were about regular human being size. Is that, do you have any evidences for that?
Not really of giants, but there were two classes of people. And they were designated by the shape of their earlobe, because one was called the long ear and the other were called the short ears. And they were called long ears because they had the equivalent of earrings, which would get larger and larger through time. The higher level of status you had the largest basically earplug. And so they were the ruling class of the society. In some cases, they are referenced as being of lighter skin than the short-eared people, and they also had a tendency of having blonde and even, or red and even blonde hair. The unfortunate thing is that no physical evidence of them has in fact been found, as far as I know, because Easter Island is very volcanic, and so the soil is very acidic, and so anyone who is buried in the ground, at least, their bones disappear quite rapidly. Also, it's Polynesia, so it's wet. So unless bones were stored in caves, then there's very little, if any, evidence of them, unless archaeologists have found the evidence, and now those artifacts are either hiding in the basement of the British Museum or the Smithsonian or the museum in Santiago in Chile.
From your research and studying a lot of these ancient sites, do you have, I mean, it seems like they built some really immense structures that we couldn't even build, let alone move the stones today. What would their intention have been in building these? Obviously, they don't appear to really have been used as burial tombs, as conventional archaeology would have us believe. What's your interpretation of that?
Well, I think it's all based on energy, and subtle energy too. There are theories that the Great Pyramids were actual power plants, so you think automatically electricity, but I think they were energy generators. I think the Great Pyramid system, of which there are, I think, 9. You have the Giza Plateau where you have 3, then you have 2 in Dashur, and then a few more, which are the classic super ancient pyramids. The dynastic Egyptians did build pyramids, but they made them out of mud brick and other soft materials, trying to replicate what the other ones looked like. And the dynastic Egyptians did likely build theirs as tombs, but they didn't build the great ones. Also, the megalithic works in Peru, especially around Cusco, the commonality between the work in Egypt and Peru and Bolivia in general is that whoever these ancient people were, they worked with very hard stone that had either a high quartz crystal content or iron content or both. And both iron and crystal are used in modern times in terms of energetics, as in crystal is what partially functions this device, the watch, etc., electronics. So I think they were energetic in nature. That the energy inside the structure was probably enhanced by the way it was constructed. And my theory is that these things were used for accessing higher levels of awareness by a very special class of people.
So just for high priests or maybe the royalty to develop a higher form of consciousness, so you don't believe they were used for any kind of technological use or generating energy for mechanical purposes or anything like that?
I used to think that they were used for what we would call energy, like electricity or whatever, but that's the unfortunate thing is that saying something like that, you're basing that opinion on what we have. So people have too much of a tendency of doing that, of saying, well, what do we, let's see, we have this and we have that, so maybe that's what they had. But if you want to really start to think on a more profound level, then you get out of the box, especially the left brain box, and then you start to almost get into a science fiction frame of mind, and that is what thing do we not have that would be good to have in the future, and look at it from that kind of perspective. So I think it was, I think they were energetic for conscious purposes, not for lighting light bulbs.
Why so many of them all over the world, do you think?
That's a really good question, and it depends on where you look. There are pyramidal structures located all over the planet, but if you get into the proper definition of pyramid, it only describes those pyramids in Egypt, because pyramid comes from the Greek pyromedos, which means the fire within or the fire in the middle, and so that is describing something energetic. And again, that's a name that the Greeks came up with when they visited Egypt to describe what these things were. They asked the Egyptian priests, what is that? And they said, well, that has the fire within. And so automatically that would tell you that that's some kind of energetic power plant, I would guess, of some kind. But the interesting thing is most of the pyramidal sites that we find are on the world grid of ley lines, which is a living function of our planet. It's not a new age, thing. It's a real thing that exists, that can be measured. It's part of what our planet produces. It does have this energetic field of lines and ley lines, and usually pyramidal type structures are built on that grid, also with water underground, because water is great at activating energy. So we find that in Peru, you find it in Mexico, you find it in England, all over the place. That's the commonality that I see.
And have you found that these structures still have those same properties, for example, raising consciousness?
Oh yeah. Every time I visit any of these sites, I'm altered, and most of the people who come on our tours as well. You enter a special field of energy, whether it's Stonehenge in England, climbing inside the Great Pyramid, a lot of the sites here in Peru, and the interesting phenomenon is you get energized when you're at these sites. Machu Picchu is another example. You feel you have greater energy. It's like your batteries are being filled up. An example of that is my wife's sister was having difficulty with the altitude in Cusco because it's 10,000 feet above sea level. And she actually lives in the United States, and she was crawling up the stairs at Machu Picchu initially, and then I got tired of them being so slow that I just took off and went along the Inca Trail. And about half an hour later, I stopped and I turned around and she was right behind me. And she said, I don't know why, I have all this energy. So it's definitely a real phenomenon. The other interesting thing is, after you leave the site, quite often you feel very drained. I don't know how to explain it. You sleep very well that night, but it's like you're being enhanced in one way, but somehow being drained another. I don't yet understand the phenomenon.
Do you think that has to do with the architecture of the structures, or is it that they're on significant ley lines, or is it the materials that the structure is made from? For example, Stonehenge is just a circle of stones, right? And so what is it that's causing this effect?
I think it's all of it. Unfortunately, most of these structures don't have the energy they once had because they've been destroyed by, or at least partially destroyed by one thing or another. So Stonehenge, a number of the stones are missing. It's like on some kind of level, it's like taking pieces of out of the back of an old TV set. You start taking the tubes out, The more tubes you take out, the less the TV is going to work. And these sites function very much the same way. I think through the catastrophic damage of 12,000 years ago, there was a lot of, some of the sites were taken literally offline because they were damaged or destroyed. And then over the course of thousands of years of people pillaging the sites, especially in Egypt for building material, then the power that they once had is either partially diminished or extremely diminished. But there still is, I still sense energy at each one of them, but some of them are more profound than others. The Serapeum that we were discussing earlier, that has the giant boxes, 100-ton boxes in them. And I'm not joking, this happens every single time. If you take your hotel key, as in the credit card looking thing that you swipe your hotel door with, if you take that into the Serapeum, when you go back to the hotel, they don't work. And that's happened every time by everybody.
So there's obviously some sort of electromagnetic energy there that's present.
Still, yeah.
Which is obviously going to have an effect on the human brain and human experience. That's interesting. Now, Dr. Sam Asmanagic, we had him out here a couple of years ago, and he has done a lot of studying. He's used different kinds of instruments to measure energy and found that the pyramids there in Bosnia are projecting an energy out into space, and that energy actually grows stronger the farther away from the pyramid you go, which is actually very unusual because normally our more conventional technology, when you transmit energy, gets weaker the farther you go. Has any kind of experimentation like that been done on any of the other sites that you've explored?
No, we're only starting to, thanks to cell phones, which I've always hated cell phones until I found out what these things can do. And with apps that you can download, I have, what do I have in here? I've got a magnetometer, I have a Gauss meter, I have a Geiger counter. So with a simple little handheld device now, you can measure all sorts of stuff, which you couldn't do in the past. You'd need, huge expensive equipment, and you would also need to get permission from the government to visit these sites to do anything like this. And now the guards have no idea what you're doing. So I can easily measure magnetic fields and things like that, and they think that I'm, watching YouTube or something. So I think it's very promising what will be coming in the next 6 months or years of what we'll be able to measure in the field and record it live to get more and more evidence that these are energetic and were profoundly energetic structures in the past.
Now, you've been under the complex of tunnels underneath the Great Pyramid and Sphinx, have you not?
Oh, yeah.
And how far down have you gone?
I've gone 3 levels down, but I've heard it could be 10, 20 levels more. And again, I wouldn't have believed it unless I had done it, because it's easy for people to say, oh, there are tunnels here, there are tunnels there. But it was just a fluke circumstance. I think my second trip to Egypt, and I was across the street from the Giza Plateau where my friend and guide Yusuf Awiyan lives, and I just told him I didn't want to sit around the house, so I said, I'm going up on the plateau. And he said, I'll come with you. And he didn't tell me anything. And this is a guy who literally, the Giza Plateau was his playground growing up, because there were no fences, no gates, no admission charge. And his father was the master guide of all of Egypt. And so we simply went up on the Giza Plateau, and he said, come with me. And we went past a sign that said no trespassing. And he met a guard friend that he grew up with and gave him a donation. And we just kept wandering so-called out of bounds on the Giza Plateau, and eventually we entered an area where this tunnel began. He said, you want to go in? And I said, okay. And we went 3 levels underneath. And he said, this is just the start of it. It keeps going down and down and down. So most people don't realize that one of the most fascinating aspects of the Great Pyramid Giza complex is not what's above ground, it's what's below ground.
So are the tunnels actually finely crafted tunnels, or just what is it like in terms of architecture?
They're kind of roughly hewn. The tallest one that I was in was about 7 or 8 feet high. Easily people can walk through them, but I believe the ones that are deeper are probably bigger, because if you believe in the idea of the Giza power plant, which is Chris Dunn's theory, that these massive tunnels were built from the Nile so that the water would travel underground under the Giza plateau and set up an electrical charge, and that the function of the Great Pyramid was to enhance and amplify that energy, and thereby setting up a major energetic field. And I've added in to that theory that the original function of the obelisks was not carved statues with hieroglyphics saying how great a pharaoh was, but that they were actually receivers. So the Great Pyramids would be the transmitters, and the obelisks were positioned in very specific sites like Karnak to receive the energy. So it's like an ancient Wi-Fi system.
Were there any markings or any kind of writings in these tunnels, or are they completely plain?
No, completely plain. And that's what's interesting about what we call the pre-cataclysmic construction, was there was no art, it was function. So that's why the interior of the Great Pyramid has no art whatsoever. Whereas dynastic tombs, you don't have a square inch without hieroglyphics and flowers and animals and stuff like that. Or the columns, all the columns are carved, everything is carved with hieroglyphics, but in all 3 Great Pyramids, none. There's nothing. And that's form and function. The same in the highlands of Peru. We have these megalithic works, but no obvious art. It's function. But the difference is, again, that the works in the highlands of Peru are more organic looking. They blend into the environment very much, whereas the Egyptian stuff is so imposing. The Great Pyramid you can see from at least 10 miles away from the highway, and it's 500 feet tall. You don't get a sense of the profoundness until you physically visit, because it's 100 times the experience of National Geographic or my videos even, or whatever.
Has there been any evidence, or even your friend, has he come across anything that would reinforce the reading done by Casey about there being a library underneath the paw of the Sphinx?
I think, again, that's a misinterpretation, because since we don't find any artwork from the time of from the construction of the Great Pyramid, then I don't think writing existed. And Stephen Mailer, the author, backs me up, or that's his theory, is that writing actually dates back maybe 7,000 years, and before that everything was recorded mentally. So I don't think that you're looking for, or that exists like a hall of actual records. The structures themselves are the records, and that's what Yusuf Awiyan's father, Abdel Hakim Awiyan, kept telling people when they would ask that question. Where's the Hall of Records? And he would say, look at the pyramid. That is the Hall of Records. Its geometry, its proportion is screaming at you what it did and who built it. But you have to be able to use more of your mind. He kept saying, wake up, use your mind. These things are trying to tell you what they were for. And that's what we're trying to do every time we go, is we decode a little bit more as we go each time. That's why the tour thing is wonderful, because we usually get 30 people of 30 different mindsets all discussing together, looking at one thing. And from our discussions, we all come out of the experience knowing more.
Is it possible? And I know a lot of these ancient structures are built using very unusual material. A lot of them are have quartz crystal in them. Are we maybe looking at this the wrong way if we're thinking about a Hall of Records? Because obviously Edgar Cayce was remarkably accurate with a lot of his forecasts. So
Yeah.
is it possible that maybe the Hall of Records is simply somehow encoded vibrationally in the actual structure itself, and at some point when we get to an evolutionary level that we can actually interpret it, it's actually there, just not in physical three-dimensional form?
Well, exactly. I mean, how these things were built puzzles. Like you'd have to be honest with yourself and say, I don't know how they were built. I don't know who built them, but whoever did that work was beyond my level of consciousness. And so with stating that, then there is so much encoded into them that it could very well be that the knowledge is holographic in nature. And, we only know of the term hologram for maybe 20 years or something. It could be something that a form of information that we have yet to rediscover. But again, you're not going to find a bunch of gold tablets. So I think he was trying to say something more poetic than literal when he made the statement about the Hall of Records. I mean, it's a hall and it has records, but they're invisible. How do we find them?
Very fascinating. So tell me more about this cataclysm. I have spoken with a lot of different people, including Dr. Paul Laviolette, who has a theory about there being a super wave that caused a lot of solar activity and activity from the center of our galaxy that blasted the Earth with a lot of radiation that triggered cataclysm. And there are other people who believe that it was a meteor that hit the Earth. There are even some stories about potentially it was some sort of thermonuclear war, because there are some parts in India where the stone has been turned to glass. What's your belief about what caused this this cataclysm? And approximately, you're saying it's about 12,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, there's mounting scientific evidence, and that's why I wrote my book Aftershock, because I looked at every theory I could, which is what I tend to do. I don't go, well, this is how it was done. It's like, well, let's look at everything and see how much of an overlap there is. And so the basic overlap from Paul Laviolette, who was a heavy source, Dr. Robert Schoch, who was a heavy source, a couple of writers called Allen and Dallaire, as well as others, is that the time frame they talk about is all the same. It's basically 11,700 to 11,900 years ago, which coincidentally fits in with the timeline of the destruction of Atlantis. But I think what actually happened was that all of them are right. And Paul Laviolette's theory is that there's a cycle about every half precession, which is around 13,000 years, whereby there's an eruption from galactic center, that the center of our galaxy is not a black hole, it's instead a pulsar. And so every cycle of 13,000 years, more or less, because the universe is not a clock, it emits energy. And this energy moves across the galactic plane and probably carries objects with it. Like when it comes in energetic contact with a comet, it'll pull the comet with it. It'll destroy planets as it goes through. And so I think that's what happened, was that this eruption from galactic center happened. It picked up comets as it was traveling towards us. And then the comet fragments hit our atmosphere and exploded, or were able to enter the ocean and exploded, or hit the ground and exploded. That also a large amount of the ice caps, both North and South Pole, were not melted, they were vaporized, and that caused the flood from the Bible, except the time frame has to go back. And that's what Dr. Schoch believes as well, that the end of the last ice age was not a gradual process. It was incredibly rapid, maybe 2 weeks. And so this event and also the plasma flares, because this energy would have gone straight through the sun and then sent plasma flares hitting our atmosphere, superheating the upper atmosphere. So you would have had vaporization of ice, then super concentration of water in the atmosphere, and then the release of that water, rising the sea level by 300 feet in 2 weeks or less. That's the Great Flood.
Now, the Hopi have a lot of traditional stories, a lot of myth about, it may not be myth, but stories that they've handed down about the time of the flood and how their race was preserved because they were one of the more pure or more conscious races of beings on Earth, and that they were allowed to carry forward into this world and to populate the Earth in this world. Are you finding any similarities in those kinds of myths and stories from other indigenous tribes?
Yeah, there are more than 200 worldwide, at least 200 from all over the planet. And they all talk about the same basic event, that most people were destroyed, that it was a very rapid event. The problem with oral tradition is that they tend to not know numbers in terms of time, because that's not, on some level, that's not their consciousness. We are, because we're obsessed with, we left-brain people are obsessed with the concept of time. So we always want to know, well, when did it happen? You know, when are we having lunch? When did it happen? And so they can't give us a timeline, but they all talk about the same event, that it was huge. It affected their world, and if it affected their world, it probably affected the entire world. But yeah, from the west coast of Canada to everywhere.
I know you have some very unusual, at least not along the mainstream belief of Atlantis and Lemuria and how they were submerged and so on. Can you share some of that?
Yeah, well, I've studied both because I've found them both fascinating from childhood. Lemuria more so because there's been so much written about Atlantis, it's insane. But Lemuria or Mu, not very much, relatively. And I lived in Hawaii for 2 years, so I was exposed to the oral tradition of Hawaii. And they spoke of a much older civilization than what we call the Hawaiians of today. And also, if you look at the map of the Hawaiian Islands, if you drop the sea level by 300 feet, more or less, almost all of the islands would be connected. So that would be one landmass that existed 12,000 plus years ago. And I think that's what Mu or Lemuria is. Atlantis, there's no way that a continent can sink, but if the sea level rises, the land disappears. So I think if you look in the Atlantic, especially in the Gulf of Mexico area and other regions, there's probably a lot of archaeological evidence underwater that would show that quite an advanced civilization lived more than 12,000 years ago, which is what we would call Atlantis because it's in the Atlantic.
I see. So you do think it was in one general geographic area then, as opposed to just being a global civilization?
I think different civilizations. I think that Mu was different than Atlantis. And a lot of the esoteric stories talk about that. They say that the Atlanteans were far more scientific, and they, like us, like to manipulate nature, which brought their own demise, which may also happen to us if we don't smarten up pretty fast. But most of the traditions of Mu or Lemuria is that they were far more either balanced in their mindset, or they were more right-brained, more philosophical, more spiritual, and that Atlantis went to war, basically tried global takeover by destroying the Mu. But I also think that's where the whole concept of the Hawaiian and Polynesian aspect of aloha comes from, which is basically love of everything. I think that predates the Hawaiians themselves, the genetic Tahitian Hawaiians, because they were quite ruthless when they entered Hawaii in the 12th century. And I don't see how such a warlike people could have a concept of aloha, because aloha, again, is universally to them meant love, not just love of people, love of everything.
So you're saying that the word aloha preceded 12,000 years, or what?
No, preceded what people don't understand is that even archaeologists will admit that the Hawaii, for example, was populated in at least two waves. The latter wave was, I believe, the 12th century AD, and those were Tahitians. But before that, you had other people living there. Some speculate that they arrived around 300 AD from the Marquesas, but the oral tradition states that they had been living there almost forever, or at least as far back as you can think of. So I think the aloha concept is a very old, ancient principle of the older people, who were called actually the Mu.
Interesting. Well, so basically, that's why you believe that Lemuria was actually the Hawaiian Islands then.
Yeah, because you can see that it was physically a large landmass 12,000 years ago. Whereas if you look in the middle of the Atlantic, you can't see, and most geologists I've spoken to said a continent can't sink. You know, it could explode if you had some kind of astonishing technology, but it's more likely that what Plato, who inherited the information from Solon, who inherited the information from the Egyptians, who inherited the information from older people, that it was poetic in nature. When you say the land sank, you're probably poetically saying or making a description of the fact that the oceans of the world rose, and it looked like the earth was sinking.
And there's a lot of evidence of deep underwater cities, and even I think in recent years there was a tsunami in India or off the coast of India that uncovered some massive city underneath the water, correct?
Yeah, that's right. When that tsunami happened, there were fishermen off the coast of southern India, and the way that a tsunami forms is that it has to pull the water back towards itself in order to build itself up. So what you would see is all of a sudden the tide goes out very far, and that tells you it's time to go inland. But because the ocean level suddenly was plunging, these fishermen all of a sudden saw these buildings appear out of the water because the water level went down. And then when the tsunami swept past, then of course they were hidden again. And from what I've heard from Graham Hancock and others, the Indian government will not allow any maritime archaeology at all, as well as the Mediterranean is supposed to have a number of cities underwater. But the governments will not allow you to go to areas which they call sensitive or restricted, because on some level, A, they probably want to protect the sites, but B, of course they don't want people diving and looting, but on some level they probably don't want that history to be shown.
So I'm curious about one thing. If a lot of these ancient sites were built 12,000 years ago and maybe much older than that, and it was right around that time that the biblical flood occurred, which supposedly, according to the Bible, was because God was angry with us, or even the Hopi tradition, a lot of people were not very spiritually conscious. And then how is it that the kind of society or civilization that had to exist in order to build these kinds of structures exceeds not only our technology but also our consciousness, could have built these kinds of structures but still have been warring, violent people that had to be wiped out?
Well, I'm not a big fan of the Atlantis thing because too much has been written about it, which is fictitious, and it's become too popular, like the Anunnaki. So it's something that when there's way too much information and way too many different opinions, then it's not a great subject to look at because it's hard to be pragmatic. But the problem that we have is we don't have any physical evidence of these ancient people. Like, we have no skeletons that date back 12,000 plus years. So that's a major enigma right now, as to what happened to them. Or who were they? Where did they come from? I'm starting to think less and less that they were necessarily a product of this planet, though they could have been. But they were definitely superior to us in terms of their capability of manipulating matter. So I would think that they would be of a much higher level of consciousness as well, because as we were discussing, I think that the whole function of these megalithic works was for enhancing the mind or accessing levels of awareness of the Akashic records, or whatever you want to call them. Why they weren't able to predict the cataclysm is another question. Maybe they were super bright, but not bright enough to withstand a cataclysmic event like that. You know, were they vaporized by the plasma? Did some of them leave to another part of the universe? That's why the fun thing about this whole pursuit is that it never ends. You get little nuggets and little diamonds, little bits of glass to put back together as you proceed. And the one thing I hate is when people say, well, we'll just never know. That's someone who isn't actually looking at this stuff. So I've been at this for a long time. It's for me, it will be never ending, because there's so much that's been lost. But I think most of it is accessible on one level or another.
So do we know concretely through geological research or carbon dating that these ancient sites are in fact 12,000 years old and not significantly older, like maybe even twice that old?
The technology is just starting to be developed for that. The problem with radiocarbon testing is that it can only test things which are organic, not meaning organic oranges, but meaning as in based on life, like plant material, human material, etc. There are new types of technology being developed. One is called cosmogenic testing, which is in its infancy. And what that does is that measures the amount of solar radiation that stone has absorbed. So it's actually the opposite of radiocarbon, because radiocarbon, or carbon-14, is the breaking down of radioactive carbon. So you can measure the half-life, and then the half-life of the half-life, and whatever percentage you come up with will tell you an age. Cosmogenic is the opposite. It's the buildup and altering of the molecular structure inside the stone. So we are hoping to be able to use that, but like I said, it's in its infancy, and our recent attempts to test stone from a site called Pumapunku in Bolivia, which is associated with another site called Tiwanaku. Unfortunately, the labs that we've been working with have been disingenuous with us.
Now, some of the ancient artifacts that I've seen seem to depict reptilian or fish-like beings, and even some of the religions such as Dagonism, which I believe evolved into Catholicism eventually, and the Pope still wears a hat that looks kind of like a fish-shaped head, right? Is there any evidence to support that there was a reptilian type of being of some kind, humanoid being or extraterrestrial being at any time?
I guess it's possible, but again, we don't have any physical evidence that's available to the public. It might be hiding in the Smithsonian or the British Museum or other museums. So it is possible. Again, my mind is very open to the idea, definitely, that there's life on other planets, because a creator would not create one little planet in the vastness of space. And when people say, well, that's because we're special, it's like, I don't think we're that special. So I think there's life teeming throughout the universe, and there's no reason, since that is likely the case, that beings would have visited our planet in the past and maybe still today, and may have steered our destiny, may have genetically altered us, because they're still looking for these so-called missing links in evolution, and they're not doing a very good job at finding them. We have these rather massive changes in the human and humanoid life form over the course of time. And so that's why they keep thinking, well, we just have to find a link in between here and there. But I think Lloyd Pye was very good at finding possible evidence of genetic manipulation of the human genome, starting maybe 120,000 years ago, which of course does fit in with the Sumerian concept as well. And the trouble, again, with oral traditions, even the Sumerian, is we can't really tell when they were speaking of, because they were likely speaking of times long before their own.
I think I've heard you say in one of your videos that you had seen somebody who was in present time who had an elongated skull. Am I remembering incorrectly?
No, we've seen two. One was in Egypt, and a huge elongated skull. But the unfortunate thing is we were in the busy traffic of Cairo, so my wife first saw it, and she just said, look, and I looked and I saw him for 2 seconds and then gone. Because, Cairo is one of the heaviest traffic cities on the planet, so there's no way to, stop the car. I don't think so. But his skull was much larger than normal. And then the other example was people who came to visit us were in the town of Nazca, which is where the famous Nazca Lines are, 4 hours drive south of me. And they photographed a man at an ATM who had a very large elongated skull. And these people are true seekers. They wouldn't do Photoshop or whatever. They just took a picture, immediately emailed it to me, and I don't know where it is right now, but very strange. And the funny thing is the Nazca area, again, is where the Paracas people who had elongated skulls also lived in the Nazca area.
So I suppose we're speculating, but it's possible that some of those races of beings still exist then.
I think their descendants do, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Are you finding, I know we're talking about how in our modern society we're kind of going the wrong way, but I'm also seeing this undercurrent of awakening happening with a lot of people. I mean, even shows like this and the research you're doing and people like Dr. Robert Schoch, and there seems like there is also a higher consciousness that's coming about in the midst of a lot of the things in the world that we don't necessarily see going in the right direction. Are you noticing, or do you believe that there is an awakening of consciousness, that quite possibly in maybe even our lifetimes we're going to come to understand a lot of these mysteries, these ancient sites, because of us, more and more people elevating to a higher level of consciousness that can match, or maybe not match exactly, but at least get closer to the consciousness of the beings who built these various sites?
Yeah, well, I see a rapid evolution in consciousness going on, and it's accelerating rapidly thanks to it's all because of the internet, I think, more than anything, which is great. The question is, will we reach critical mass in time? And I don't think so. I see millions of people waking up to this, but I have to be honest in saying that I don't think we'll reach the percentage required before something really awful is going to happen. What we require is a complete change, which would have to go through collapse of the economic system, the political system, the banking system, and the way we look at history. And I think all of those are underway right now, but will they be gentle in transition? No, it'll be a collapse. And so the rebuilding process, I'm hopeful for, but to be realistic, I don't think we have enough time. And I don't think enough people are waking up, because I'm living in Peru, and you walk down the streets of Lima, for example, the majority of people are working on a subsistence basis on our planet. They don't have time to think. Not that they're stupid, but they're so busy trying to feed their families on $1 or $10 or whatever a day, they don't have time to have philosophical conversations about anything. And too many people are getting absorbed into what it's called reality television, which is completely the opposite of that. So I try to do my bit, as you are, to raise people's consciousness. I hope that we have a bright future, but I won't be surprised, or wouldn't be surprised, if it turns really bad.
What about some of the, I don't know what belief you have in this, but there are a lot of long-term planetary cycles of consciousness, such as the various yugas that are described in Indian writings, and that we are heading into an age of higher consciousness. Do you have any understanding of those cycles?
Well, I definitely believe we are moving into a level, or a wave, or a period of higher consciousness, because that's what the Hopi elders said. They were very displeased at the end of 2012 with all of these people writing books and making movies and fear-mongering without consulting them about what the actual prophecy was. And they got it wrong, 100% wrong. The Hopi elders made statements saying, we never said we're moving into a period of darkness. We never said there's going to be a catastrophe. We're moving out of darkness into light. And I think that's what we are. And I'm very hopeful of that.
Other than anything we've already talked about today, what are some of the more really exciting findings or areas maybe you're working on excavating or researching, or anything new that you're seeing coming down the line in ancient sites, or even in the various skulls or things that you're discovering around the world? Is there anything else that we might not have discussed?
Well, it's actually, each one of these is a fascinating subject, and I try to be a specialist, unlike some authors, Graham Hancock's an example. He knows about many different places on the planet, so you can ask him about Göbekli Tepe or whatever, and he has an opinion because he's been there. But I like to focus my knowledge down to Peru, Bolivia, Egypt, Lebanon, moving into the Middle East, Polynesia and the Pacific, and more or less keep it there on some extent. So whenever I don't have anything new to say about something, or if I can't learn something new about something, I switch to one of the other topics. So for example, we have results of DNA results from 3 of the Paracas skulls in Peru. That took 1.5 years because of problems. But so now we've made a formal request with the Ministry of Culture here in Peru to test 15 more, because we want a scientific analysis. 3 is going to tell you something, but it's not going to tell you enough. So you need 15 or 20. So that's been submitted to the Ministry of Culture. So I can't do anything about that right now. I have to wait for the bureaucratic system to move somewhere. And so that's why all of a sudden today I thought, well, I don't know as much about the Maya as I should. And we saw evidence when we were at Palenque, which is a major Mayan location in Mexico, possible ancient lost technology. Like the stone working, I saw major discrepancies between standard Mayan technology and some of the stuff I was looking at. So it's like maybe there was someone here before the Maya, much, much farther back in time. And maybe that site was destroyed by the cataclysm, and maybe the Maya found it and rebuilt it. The Maya also, their elite had elongated heads. Where did that come from? Also, might be going to India in January There's quite a bit of evidence I've seen in photographs of lost ancient high technology in some of the structures that the ancestors of the present Indian population found and enhanced with art. Again, you're talking megalithic structures. And then March, we're going back to Egypt for our 5th annual tour. And whatever else comes up, I guess. And the most important thing is I don't work in isolation, and I don't like to be praised for what I do. I'll take it, but I don't seek it out, because I'm one of, I'm a grain of sand on a beach here. There's so many people who are now looking at this. I try as much as possible to get more and more of my stuff out on YouTube and my website and Facebook and stuff, so that people can look at this stuff and have a chance of learning the true nature of our history. If they buy my books, it's great, but 90% of what I do is for free, because that's what you have to do in this day and age. And it makes me feel like I'm actually doing something with my life, which is good. So I have no idea what's coming. I plan to do this until the day I drop. There's no concept of retirement. So I'm just thankful that you, Ethann, have invited me to come on and discuss this with you and your listeners and viewers.
Thank you. Have you ever heard of the book, The Mayans' Antiram?
No.
Oh, the Mayans' Antiram was a series. It was a small book, actually, that was translated from some ancient writings in just recent years. I think in the last 10 or 15 years, they were translated from a very ancient language in India that apparently only a handful of people can actually translate. And a very limited number of the translations were put into a book form, and the people who have them apparently don't want to part with them. So you can't actually get a reprint of it or anything now. But I do know. I'm sure you're familiar with Nassim Haramein.
Yeah.
Okay. So I talked to Nassim some years ago about it. He happens to have one of the copies of these books, and in the book it talks about. It's apparently a historical record of this being who went by the name of Mayan, or was referred to as Mayan, and he supposedly taught the beings on Earth about technology and architecture. Also, a lot of the ancient architectural techniques were things that he taught, mathematics, astronomy, and supposedly the Mayan race or civilization was named after him. So fascinating. I'd love to get my hands on it. And even in the book, it actually goes into the actual workings of how to build a spacecraft, a UFO type of craft. So very fascinating. If we get a hold of it, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on it at some point.
Well, yeah. And in regard to what we were just talking about, in future, there are going to be discoveries because we're not constrained by solely asking archaeologists to write a book or make a video or whatever about stuff. It's, it's multifaceted. Different people are looking from different perspectives, but a lot of stuff is going to show up that's going to just be mind-blowing and show how complex the past is. For example, there's a form of hieroglyphic writing on Easter Island called Rongo Rongo, and nobody knows where it came from. The standard story by archaeologists is, well, the people of Easter Island just made it up. But there's a very similar looking script in the Indus Valley. So people were traveling the world's oceans thousands of years before most people understand or would admit, like profound voyages. So it is possible that Rongo Rongo does come from the Indus Valley, and the people, they're also growing stories from different parts of the world of where people of higher levels of consciousness and intelligence were chased out of their homelands. Recently, there's a lady who lives in New Zealand, and she is a native New Zealander, Maori, but her bloodline is different because standard story is that the Maoris come from Tahiti. That's what archaeologists will tell you. But she has genetically red hair, and she had her DNA tested, and she's 30% Persian. So that's, that's not Persia, Tahiti, to New Zealand. That means that the Persians were visiting New Zealand thousands of years before or probably thousands of years before the native Maori people got there. And so we're going to be seeing more and more of this interesting movement, ancient movements of peoples. The more people get their DNA tested, they'll find out that they're not 100% Scotch-Irish that they thought they were, that they're a bit of this, a bit of that. And so, naturally anyone with an inquisitive mind would want to find out who were these ancestors. And it makes us all more and more, over time, more human, because we'll start to see more ways in which we're similar and more ways in which we're more complicated than what we thought. I personally haven't had my DNA tested, but I embrace whatever the test shows. If it shows that I'm 5% whatever, it's great. I want to know who those ancestors are. That makes me a complicated person. It's kind of boring to say, well, I'm German, Scotch, Irish, or whatever. It's like, what if you're a bit of this, a bit of that? What was the journey for this ancient ancestor to get to meet, meet and mate, and etc. It'll be fascinating as time goes on.
I'm getting the feeling now, the hieroglyphics, how far back do hieroglyphics date?
Well, that's the weirdest thing, is that on my fourth trip to Egypt in April of this year, we saw possible evidence of the 12,000-year-old cataclysm because stone had been scorched, like it had been blasted with heat, as in relating to Robert Schoch's theory. And some of that stone had hieroglyphics on it. And so this is the first time I'm discussing this. And I went to Stephen Mailer, who's one of the experts who was on the tour. And I said, when did hieroglyphics show up and how long did it take to evolve? And he said, it seemed to have been spontaneous in the first dynasty. And hieroglyphics are profoundly complicated. They can't just develop rapidly like that. I think they were an inheritance of an older civilization, and that the dynastic Egyptians reinterpreted them and reused them.
I'm getting the feeling that maybe hieroglyphics are not just literal in the way that we're translating them now, that maybe they're quite possibly holographic in some sense, and we can't at this point understand on a level to be able to interpret them like that. Does that make any sense?
Definitely. Well, like we were discussing earlier, original languages exclude English, but original indigenous languages on some levels had profound levels of understanding and meaning. And so it was your ability to be able to, or lack of ability to be able to penetrate these depths that made them more and more powerful the deeper you went. An example, going back to Hawaiian, is there's speaking Hawaiian. So Hawaii, Maui, this is named after that. Oh, okay, whatever. Then there's the second level, which is the level below it, is called kauna, and that is the hidden meaning. So that's where we get into that the name itself is telling you something. It's describing itself. It's describing one location, because the Hawaiian word for a place name is only for that place. You don't have so-and-so 1, so-and-so 2 or 3. You have Kona means the side of the island, the Kona side, and that is for each of the islands. But also then the third level of understanding was the chant. And so only the priestly class knew and know that. And that is chanting, but using the sound and the words as vibration. So they would use it as an example, almost like a Tibetan bowl that would be, in this case, full of water. And they would chant and focus their energy to hit the right vibration to be able to make the water ripple in a special way. So they weren't just transmitting sound, they were transmitting an energy and a vibration. And then the fourth level, there may be more levels, but the fourth level is actually being able to chant on a level where you can alter things like the weather. So I actually personally witnessed that once when I was living in Hawaii. So it not only did exist, it does exist. But ancient languages such as Hawaiian or the Suf language of Egypt or some of the ones from the Middle East would have all had that. Whether they still exist intact is unknown by me.
Very fascinating. Well, I know you've written 20-some books now, right?
Yeah, working on 22 and 23.
So where can our viewers find out? I know probably all your books are on Amazon, but where can they get your books and find out about your various tour dates and the retreats that you do? Give us an idea of some of the websites and places they can do that.
Okay, well, everything is focused, and I have a full-time webmaster because this site is so huge. My website is hiddenincatours.com. That's Hidden Inca Tours. And 5% of the website is about tours. The rest of it is all free information. 850 YouTube videos, photo sets, articles, interviews like this, etc., etc. So it's all located on that website. And now we're building a bigger one for many different researchers called hiddenhumanhistory.com. And so that will be, that's been in the works for about 2 years. And it'll be like a mega media website.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll have you out here again and on my show, and also maybe have you out here in Michigan to one of our future Awaken and Part Expos as well. But thank you for taking this time out today to meet with me and to share all your wisdom with our viewers. And we'll be speaking really soon.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Awaken and Power TV with my special guest, Brien Foerster. Join me next week as we speak with another incredible individual who's standing on the leading edge and changing the world.